Hi, this is Dr. Mike Weigold, and this lecture is part of a discussion of the advertising environment, and it's the portion about the history and development of modern advertising. So here are your objectives as we go through this material. First, understand the historical developments that have created the advertising industry, particularly in the United States. Second, try to answer why advertising did not emerge until the mid to late 19th century in the U.S. and even later than that elsewhere around the world. Why is advertising more prevalent here than it is in other countries? So to begin, rather than just focus on the history of advertising, I thought I'd give you a brief history of everything. This history of everything is so brief that it will be done completely within a single slide. I know you can't wait. So here we go. History of everything. First of all, the universe. How old is the universe? Scientists estimate the Big Bang occurred about 15 to 20 billion years ago. What happened before that? I'm not smart enough to tell you that. I have no idea. The Earth actually formed about 5 billion years ago. So the Earth is a rather young bit of matter in the much older universe. Life on Earth, only about 3.5 billion years or so old. So for about 1.5 billion years, no life on Earth. And for about 3.5, we've had life, but for much of that time, the life that existed here was quite primitive. The first mammals are really new to this teeming world that we live in. The first mammals only appeared about 200 million years ago. And the first Homo sapiens, well, we're really babies in the scheme of things, only 160,000 years or so ago. So for certainly most of the history of the Earth and even most of the history of mammals, there haven't been any people. The first civilizations emerged around the part of the world we now know as the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East, largely where modern-day Iraq is. First emerged about 5,500 years ago or so, when human beings developed skills at raising livestock and planting crops, and so could settle and develop cities. Now in all that, how old is the ad industry? Only about 120 to 150 years old. It's very, very young. So it seems as though the universe existed quite well for most of its time without advertising. In fact, it even seems like civilization existed quite well without any advertising industry. Why has the advertising industry largely been absent from the development of civilization on Earth? And, just as important, why do we have one now? Well, to answer that question, we need to think about why there's a need for an advertising industry in the first place. Rather than ask why it took so long for advertising to happen, we should ask the question, why do we need advertising at all? And I'm guessing a few of you might think, we don't need advertising. In fact, life might be better without advertising. Well, rather than address that question, I'm going to talk about some of the historical developments that occurred in the United States that have led to the development, almost inevitably led to the development of an advertising industry. So, advertising is not possible without wealth, at least a certain amount of wealth. And I would describe wealth as both a cause and a consequence of advertising, a point I'll elaborate on in a moment. Second, advertising is a form of mass communication, and without the mass, there's no need for advertising. So population has to grow to a certain level before advertising really begins to make sense as a way of communicating. Third, a society requires industrialization to have an ad industry. And what I mean by that is a society requires machinery and technologies that can mass produce goods and services. If things cannot be produced on a mass level, then there's really no need to use advertising to try to develop target markets. Another important cultural development in the history of advertising is the emergence of capitalism or free markets as a way of distributing goods and services in an economy. And capitalism is a relatively new way of people relating to one another. In Europe, prior to the 18th century, for example, there was a feudal system in which kings and nobility determined what was grown or what was made and who got what. Capitalism is very new, and capitalism is important for advertising because capitalism means consumers make decisions about what they're going to use. Advertising travels to consumers through media, and without media, there's no advertising. So another item we can add to our checklist of what's required for advertising is free media. Maybe a little bit less important, but still in the scheme of things, part and parcel of what we're talking about is a transportation system that allows people who manufacture goods in one place to transport those goods to another place for sale. So if you're only serving a local market, it's a lot easier to communicate to the people who live in that market because they see you, they see your store, they see your business. But once a company manufactures something in Chicago and wants to sell it in San Francisco or New York, now they're going to need to communicate with consumers. Okay, as promised, let's dive into these things a little bit more carefully. So we'll start with wealth. Are people living in the United States wealthy? Well, certainly by historical standards, and also, as we'll see, by even contemporary standards, Americans are very wealthy people. So if we look at the U.S. Real GDP per capita, that means per person, between the years 1800 through the year 2000, we see a steady growth with just a couple of blips, steady growth in wealth, in personal wealth. So if you lived in the United States in the year 1800, you had very little. What you consumed, you probably grew yourself or hunted or made yourself. As we get into the late 1800s, we start to see a steady rise in wealth among people living in the United States, and that trend generally continues through the end of the 1920s. For those of you versed in history, the end of the 1920s brought the Great Depression, and there was a huge drop-off in personal wealth during the Depression. That led to a huge recovery following the Second World War. The Second World War ended in 1945, and you can see through the 1940s, wealth in the United States grew. And we're lucky that, for the most part, there's been continued growth in the United States. Of course, right now we're in a difficult economic time, but for most of U.S. history, we've had a very good economy. And if we make comparisons across different countries, we can see that here too, the United States performs fairly well. So GDP per capita in U.S. dollars shows that the United States does very well even among industrialized nations of the world, so that we're very wealthy people. In fact, in this chart, the only country that exceeds us in per capita GDP is Norway. Okay, population is also important for the development of advertising, and so if we look at world population growth throughout history, what can we see there? Well, in essence, through roughly the 14 to 1500s, there was really very little population in the world. The world did not sustain many people. People died young, and medical treatments were quite poor. As we hit the 20th century, the late 1800s, 1900s, and then the 20th century, we see that the population of the world surged, and this is due to improvements in all sorts of places, but certainly medical technologies, agriculture, all of the places that make life comfortable and safe for us took place around that period of time. In the United States, this played out the following way, going back to the founding of the country around the 1790s. Very small population of less than 10 million people. That population begins a very steep increase again in the late 1800s. That abates a little bit during the Depression and the beginnings of World War II, and then starting with the 1950s and onward, we see a steady population growth in the United States. And we see that demographers expect that growth to continue far into the future. And that population is also living very different lives. And in particular, more of the population is living in urban areas where people work in white-collar jobs than in, more of the population is living in urban areas and far fewer in rural areas, which is characterized by farming. So we can see the transformation here, farming and rural areas indicated in the gray in the chart in front of you, the yellow indicating the percentage of people living in urban areas. So United States population from 1800 through very close to the present day is growing and is becoming more urban. People are relying less on growing foods and for their lives and more on working in companies or factories. Concomitantly with this is the United States achieving world preeminence as having the greatest manufacturing production in the world. Now, you can see that it was actually at the conclusion or near the years where World War I was going on that the United States achieved that, as European nations were involved in a terrible war among the countries that you see there. At that point in time, the USA, which was largely untouched, achieved world preeminence in manufacturing. If we updated this chart, we know that today the United States faces a significant challenge from China and less developed parts of the world and industrialization. And finally, we have capitalism. So capitalism is this notion of a free market. And we may take that for granted, but if we look at least one depiction of economic freedom in the world, we can see that capitalism and free markets, which are indicated in blue, are not really the norm. Countries work out a variety of ways of distributing goods and services to people who need them. Countries that are committed to capitalism include the United States, Canada, Australia, and parts of Europe. But major portions of the globe still do not embrace free markets. Okay, we also need free media. Now, I called these free media before, and by that I did not mean free as in the alligator, you pick it up and it doesn't cost you anything. I mean ad-supported media. So you might ask yourself, what's the alternative to that? What's the alternative to ad-supported media? There are two alternatives. One is advertising-free media, which charge the full price in order to recoup their costs. So, for example, if a magazine decided not to carry any ads, then it could still be sold to consumers, but consumers would have to pay a lot more money for that magazine because to cover the cost of production, the publisher would have to charge a great deal or go out of business. That model has been tried. It's not been terribly successful. The other alternative to ad-supported media is government-supported media. So public television, public radio are to a degree subsidized by governmental support. In the United States, by and large, our commitment is to free media, which means media supported by advertising revenue. And if we look how that developed, one of the key developments was Gutenberg's invention in Strasbourg of movable type. Movable type, when Gutenberg invented movable type, it was possible to print things, but you would set letters in lead and you could not rearrange the letters. So you could print a book, for example, but once the plates were used for the book, you had to throw them away. That was it. Movable type meant that people could create newspapers or magazines or something temporary by moving the letters about. And that was Gutenberg's great contribution, which transformed the world forever. It was a very important achievement that he was able to carry out. The idea of sending messages to people via the airwaves so that they could receive it in their homes and actually hear voices or music was radio. Radio became popularized in the U.S. in the 1920s. Before the advent of radio, advertising was defined as something that happened in print. And just as radio transformed our understanding of advertising, so too did the introduction of television in the 1950s. In the year 1950, only about 10% of all Americans had a TV set. By the year 1959, almost everyone had a TV set. It was an extremely successful innovation. Cable was introduced to provide television service to rural areas, but quickly allowed consumers even greater choice in terms of their viewing habits. And of course, the introduction of the internet in the 1990s and social and mobile media has continued the evolution of the technologies that bring us messages. So these innovations always impact the ad